committees. I want to welcome everybody to this joint legislative hearing of the Senate Natural Resources and Water and the Environmental Quality Committees. I'd like to thank everyone for being here at this important hearing. First off, Senator Pavley is unable to attend today's hearing. However, she has asked that I read her opening remarks into the record, which I'll do in a moment. When Senator Pavley and I first discussed doing this hearing, it was clear that the Underground Injection Control Program, or the UIC program, needed oversight and review. And while that is still true, that the UIC program should be inspected as a whole, recent media revelations in the Cal EPA's report last week show that there's an urgent need to address this situation. There's injection wells that have been permitted by the Department of Conservation, and the injection has occurred into aquifers that have either not been exempt by the United States Environmental Protection Agency or where the exemption status is under review. And our primary goal, or at least as the chair of environmental quality, is to protect public safety and health. That's my charge here as a senator. So these aquifers have water quality that may make them available as sources of underground drinking water. And this has been happening for decades. It also appears that this administration has known about this for at least 4 years, and it is only taking corrective steps to assess and stop contamination now. How is this possible? Especially when the state of California is struggling with a historic drought, conserving as much water as possible, legislating about groundwater rights, going to the voters to approve spending for new water storage and new treatment technology to meet California water needs, that we are continuing to inject into potential drinking water sources. Now, today's hearing is the first of an opportunity for the administration to explain how we arrived here and what is being done to correct this situation and ensure this type of mistake does not occur again. I will now read Senator Pavley's statement, and we'll begin with our first panel. Good morning. Over the last 8 months since the state oil and gas regulator, the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, DOGGR, issued the first of its shutdown orders to stop oil and gas well operators from disposing of oil and gas wastewaters by injecting them into good quality or potentially good quality groundwaters, there has been a series of newspaper articles describing an ever-increasing number of injection wells that may be injecting material into the wrong groundwater. DOGGR has acknowledged this. Here we are in the 4th year of a serious drought, and the actions of the oil and gas regulator are threatening the state's precious groundwater supply. The purpose of today's hearing is to find out how this was allowed to happen. We know that near these oil and gas wells, there are water wells that are being used for drinking and other purposes. I represent part of Ventura County, where oil and gas production coexists with agriculture and a growing population. We cannot allow our precious groundwater resources to be compromised by negligence. How can I assure my constituents that DOGGR is protecting their drinking and irrigation water from oil and gas contamination when it doesn't appear that it is? These injection wells are part of the Underground Injection Control Program, or UIC program, that DOGGR applied for and received primacy from the United States Environmental Protection Agency in the early 1980s to run on its behalf. This primacy agreement, or actually both of them, because we know now there are 2 versions, clearly requires that DOGGR not allow injection from oil and gas wells into good quality groundwaters that were not formally exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act's protections. Yet, DOGGR did anyway, and frankly continues to allow the operation of suspect oil and gas wells while its and the Water Board's investigations continue. Issues with the UIC program go well beyond aquifer exemptions alone, as the 2011 U.S. EPA audit of the program made clear. DOGGR, in fact, acknowledged that improvement was necessary in a series of budget requests starting with the fiscal year 2010-11 through fiscal year 2012-13 budgets that resulted in over 50 new permanent positions. The legislature ultimately gave Dogger what it asked for. Many plans were written and commitments made to bring Dogger into compliance with the law and its own regulations during the budget process. The recent news reports indicate little progress has been made. The UIC regulations are well over 20 years old. Dogger personnel continues to ignore law and regulations. Fracking and the use of open, unlined pits to dispose of oil and gas wastewaters have also been in the news lately, but the subject of this hearing is the injection well program. However, it was the implementation of my bill, SB 4, which regulates fracking, that brought this injection well permitting problem to light. It is also true that SB 4 would have been very different if the true state of the Aquifer Exemption Program, which last week's Cal EPA report makes clear, was well known internally by then. It was communicated to me and my legislative colleagues as it should have been. My new bill, SB 248, will shortly be amended to reflect the outcome of this hearing and provide legislative direction on the much-needed reform of the oil and gas UIC program. However, what assurances do I and my colleagues in the legislature have that Dogger will not continue to ignore state and federal law and regulations? Dogger has serious credibility and performance problems. I will be listening today for its plans and pledge to continue oversight efforts. That was Senator Fran Pavley's opening statement, and we wish her well. All right, let's jump into it. Our first panel is the state regulatory agency. We have the director of the Department of Conservation, Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources, Dr. Mark Nekadom, and Jonathan Bishop, the Chief Deputy Director of the State Water Resource Board, and Stephen Broham, the supervisor of the Dogger program. Oh, as you come forward, I will note we have a timing or a scheduling matter that we will at 10:15 make sure that we hear from Secretary Laird, the Secretary of the Natural Resources. I'm remiss, was there any other members that had an opening remark before we hear from the first panel or a comment? Great. Dr. Nekadom, good morning and welcome to our joint hearing. Please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members, ladies and gentlemen of the public. My name is Dr. Mark Nekadom. I'm the Director of the Department of Conservation. With me is Dr. Steve Boland, the Supervisor of the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, and Jonathan Bishop, Chief Deputy for the State Water Board. My purposes this morning are twofold. First, to describe briefly the recent history and timeline of events and decisions that have led to our current status. Second, to share with you our work with our fellow state agencies and US EPA on developing a path forward. Dr. Boland will take it from there and provide important details of the path forward for full compliance with the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. I appreciate your convening the joint hearing this morning of both committees, and we are eager to address this very important topic of underground injection control, or UIC, as we will refer to the program periodically throughout our presentations. The Underground Injection Control Program has overseen the provisions of this federal the Safe Drinking Water Act for Class II wells since 1983. Class II injection wells are wells that inject fluids associated with oil and gas production back down into the geological formations. It is important to understand that every gallon of oil produced in California comes to the surface mixed with more than 19 gallons of water from the same geological formation. This is usually very salty water, referred to as having a high concentration of total dissolved solids, or TDS, as we normally refer to the metric of saltiness in water. That water has also residual oil components in it. What happens to that produced water is one of the most important considerations of the UIC program. Nearly 75% of the water produced with oil is injected back into the same zones that it came from. As a means of enhancing oil production, this is also called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. Another 20% of the water from oil production is injected into disposal wells, many of which are drilled into former oil-producing zones that are now depleted or of economically recoverable resources. The remaining 5% of the water is of sufficiently low TDS so that once the oil and related chemicals are removed, the water can be discharged for other purposes, including agriculture and other beneficial uses. It is enhanced oil recovery and water disposal wells that are the focus of our attention for purposes of today's hearing. Under current laws and regulations, injection of produced water can only occur into areas underground that contain no water at all, or into areas where the water is higher than 10,000 TDS, or into areas that have been deemed exempt from the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act because they are too contaminated or because there is oil in the zone that makes the zone a candidate for exemption. The premise is that some water underground is associated with chemicals, including oil, that make the native water unsuitable for beneficial use. The recent history of UIC implementation should be understood before I turn the presentation over to Dr. Bolin, and I will describe some of the history here in a moment. When I came to the department in January 2012, the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources faced a number of interrelated challenges. In order to get a handle on how these challenges could be dealt with in a systematic way, we developed a roadmap, which we shared with the legislature in April 2012. That roadmap included issues like hydraulic fracturing, underground injection control, improved data management for public transparency, and several other major policy and program implementation issues that we needed to resolve. By the time we had moved through the spring of 2012, it was quite clear that the administration and the legislature expected our department to be fully engaged on hydraulic fracturing. I believe most of you know the history. We did listening sessions and public workshops through the summer of 2012. We developed a discussion draft of regulations for hydraulic fracturing by the winter of 2012, and we conducted another series of workshops on those draft regulations through spring and summer of 2013, even as SB 4 was being developed. My point is simply that the department was fully engaged on hydraulic fracturing and well stimulation, which became the most significant issue to confront the division in probably the last 2 or 3 decades. Nonetheless, we continued to work simultaneously through the UIC issues. After a May 2012 letter from US EPA, we developed a process in cooperation with US EPA that focused on how to review aquifers for consistency with the exemption process. That process continued until approximately the fall of 2013, when US EPA expressed concern about the pace of the department's progress. In hindsight, US EPA's concern was quite justified. The department had become consumed with SB 4 implementation, and focus on UIC reform had simply flagged. As we came to appreciate their concern about our slow progress, we recommitted to working through the fundamental problems of the UIC program with all of our partners, the state board, regional boards, US EPA, etc. In the course of our collaborative implementation of SB 4, particularly the groundwater monitoring provisions, with the state board, we discovered that the state board in particular had very grave concerns about the injection wells into non-exempt aquifers. That was also our concern. The department increased its attention, along with the state board and US EPA, to changes in the UIC program. Further, the work between the division and US EPA on implementing UIC reforms accelerated. Working collaboratively, the department, US EPA, and the state board developed a process for conducting a comprehensive review of the entire UIC program. Now, we are currently looking at the underlying regulations to determine if they are still appropriate to the technology and practice of Class II injection after 30 years. We are also looking very closely in cooperation with our partners at our UIC permitting practices going forward. And we are examining the history of past permits to identify whether any were issued improperly or whether the injection projects present a potential threat to groundwater for beneficial uses. This last part is a very protective view aimed at erring on the side of closure where there are water supply wells nearby. We have reviewed with the State Board hundreds of wells since last July and have issued orders or obtained voluntary relinquishments of permits to shut down injection wells that could present a threat to groundwater. Some have wondered why we have not shut in more wells. It is important for the committees to understand the nature of the challenge we have in reforming the UIC program. We are examining wells that have already been permitted. Some of those may have been permitted in areas not previously approved for injection, but which are appropriate for injection. Others may be wells that should never have been approved. We need to review the past approvals, and we need to use a protective filter that errs on the side of well closure when water supply sources are potentially at risk. We also must recognize that some injection wells are nowhere near water supply wells and present no risk to beneficial uses of groundwater. The Water Board is currently testing wells in question to determine whether there is any risk to public health. So far, there has been none. However, we must make sure we don't issue cease and desist orders in a blanket fashion, given that some approved wells might actually be appropriate and safely injecting. Now, with your concurrence, I would like to transition the presentation to Dr. Bolin. Dr. Bolin was appointed by the governor last June. As oil and gas supervisor, we're pleased to have his expertise with us in the department.